The Baron scoffs at your proposal and says, "You wouldn't dare fight here in the war room."
I've had enough of this talk. I draw my weapon. Face me, you fiend.
Roll for initiative.
No.
Greetings, Dungeon Masters. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
So on today's episode, we're taking a look at running combat, which is a very difficult part for a new DM or any DM running their game at the table.
Yeah, Dungeon Masters running 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons are really blessed because the rules for combat are quite streamlined. Nevertheless, there's a lot of things to manage between initiative and hit points, all the monster statistics, and all the things that your players can do. Keeping on top of all that at the same time as trying to roleplay and make this really cinematic, descriptive battle can be a really big challenge for new DMs. So we've got a couple tips and tricks for you so that you can run combat like a pro.
So let's take a look. So Monty, we're playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and combat is about to break out. How do we know when and where is the right time to start combat?
This is actually the most difficult question sometimes. It's not always as simple as saying, roll for initiative.
Which is a classic term that we all love to hear. Mm-hmm. But, sometimes combat can just spring out of nowhere. Sometimes it's well thought out and planned. But when to say roll for initiative is sometimes a big challenge.
Yeah, and I like to always keep in the back of my mind, whenever I'm going to have a combat encounter, what are the stakes? What's the dramatic question of the fight? Because this is going to help guide all the role-playing that's going to occur over the course of that battle. Not every battle has to be fought to the death. In fact, with many humanoid enemies and intelligent foes, they should be running away as soon as they start taking a little bit of damage, because most people in the world are not as crazy as the player characters.
That was one of the most interesting lessons that I had to learn as a DM, was not to fight to the death all the time. Sometimes my villains needed to run away, and it's actually improved the combat a lot. It made it more interesting to have villains that might flee or might try to hide or would use things to their advantage in combat other than just standing there and fighting.
Mm-hmm. I think the most clear-cut thing to bear in mind with starting combat encounters is really take it from the beginning. As soon as that initiative is rolled, the world kind of flips over, you get out the battle mats. There's a lot of prep that you can do in advance for starting combat. I like to print out cards with the monster stats on them to have handy at the table so I'm not flipping through the monster manual. And I like to be sure that I've made a few notes of my own before the game session about where combat might happen, so that I'm always prepared for those crazy situations, like at the beginning of the episode when the player decides to draw their swords in the midst of a negotiation.
Now, sometimes players can instigate combat and assume that they get an advantage by being the first ones into the room or something of that nature. But that's not always the case.
Well, that's called surprise.
And that's the next thing that we're going to talk about.
Surprise can be one of the most difficult things to adjudicate as the Dungeon Master, of when it should be awarded and when you should and when it shouldn't be used. A really common thing that both experienced and new Dungeon Masters do is you'll have this social interaction scene that breaks out into combat, and one player immediately says, "I draw my sword," or "I throw a fireball." And that action is resolved, and then initiative is rolled.
But that's not always the right way to do it. Technically, if you think of it like a draw, if one person reaches for their weapon, the other person still has a lot of time to react. And initiative actually takes place of who can act first. Mm-hmm. And so it's not always about who moved first, it's who's the fastest to move.
Yeah, I like to remind my players, and as a rule of thumb, any declaration of hostile intent, a player saying, "I want to attack" or cast a spell, or a monster or non-player character deciding to, that is the moment at which you should roll the initiative. And then the instigating action is resolved when that belligerent gets their turn. The reason for this is that In real life, if you are talking to somebody, if you are standing face to face with somebody, it is actually surprisingly difficult for you to punch them in the face without them getting the opportunity to react. Unless you've done something to distract them in some way, or you're just naturally faster than them. What does this mean? Well, you should be asking players to make deception or stealth checks if they're trying to reassure somebody so that they're caught off guard, or use the initiative system because the dexterity score is added to the roll, which represents people's natural quick reactions. Don't be generous with giving out stealth. There should always be some sort of stealth or deception before surprise is just given out because it's a massive advantage.
Yeah, and this means that you don't automatically get surprise if you yell out, I attack. Surprise needs to be a little bit more interesting than that. You need to sneak up on the enemy. You need to be hidden. You need to gain that advantage strategically, not just by yelling, I attack. So when you're the DM at the table and your player yells, I attack, don't award them surprise. Let initiative handle how fast their attack hits versus that of the opposing people.
And I will say, like, to that note, is if you choose to say, I cast Fireball, and you resolve the Fireball, then roll for initiative, what you've effectively done is given the player the advantage of surprise for that first Fireball. So if you let Fireball go off and then give your player surprise, you've basically given them double surprise. So don't be surprised when they completely demolish that combat encounter. Generally speaking, players are going to have a really easy time in any battle that they get to act with surprise over their enemies with. So be stingy with giving that out.
Tracking initiative is one of the most important parts of combat because it's going to determine the order in which people take their turns. What are some of the options that we have for tracking initiative?
Well, I have seen a ton of different ways that this is done over the years. I've seen some dungeon masters will hang little cards over top of their DM screen with the order of the attackers in. There's a ton of accessories and products that help you track initiative with like magnets and stuff like that. And in the past, we used to use playing cards with the players' names written on them and stacked up. But I'm going to tell you right now, what we're going to show you is the fastest way to get all the initiative results from your players and track it on a sheet. And unfortunately, it is dead simple. To do this, all you need is a blank sheet of paper. And you might be thinking, you're just going to have me write a list. And yes, I am just going to have you write a list. But the thing about initiative is that when you often go around, you're usually going around the table being like, Kelly, what did you get for initiative? Monster 1, what did you get for initiative? Player 3, what did you get for initiative? And so it gets difficult to like make a list in order. You might see like Matt Mercer goes like, who has an initiative between 20 and 21? And then writes those people down first. That's even slower than this, right? So the way that I do it is this. Kelly, what did you get for initiative?
I got 6.
So then I'm going to take my piece of paper and I'm going to write 6 and Kelly towards the bottom of the piece of paper. And then what's going to happen is the next person who gets a 12, I just go a couple spaces up, write 12, and write Monster 2 right in there. And the result is I get this list that I'm building out of order, but I can just go around the table and write those in as I go. It's really fast, and the result is a handwritten list that goes from top to bottom that you can very easily keep track of, and you'll never forget the order that people go in. After that, it's really just as simple as keeping a check mark as you go down the list and making sure that you never miss anyone's turns. We've done other things in the past, like we used to take playing cards and write them in and make a stack of paper and then flip them off, and that way we never miss someone's turn.
Yeah.
And there's some cool magnetic accessories out there, but this is so much faster. And the great thing about it too is if you use a piece of graph paper like I do, it's really easy to count out enough spaces between each of the turns as you make your list. The other piece of advice that I like to have for DMs is I often pre-roll initiative before the game session for all of my NPCs, and I start writing down these sheets in advance. So, sometimes I'll even just assume that they rolled a 10 or a 15. I'll give the boss monster a 15 plus their dex mod as their initiative.
Just to make sure that they go earlier in the combat.
And don't get ganked.
And yeah.
Yeah, right? And some people might be like, you're just cheating as a DM. And I'll be like, well, I can do that. I'm the DM.
So another great way to track initiative is actually from Axe and Shield, who I saw on Twitter, and he sells his own initiative trackers that I believe is a pole with little pieces that you put on that have the character names on them. Just another
this
tool
is
for tracking
similar
initiative.
to the way of like having it over the screen, and people like that because it lets the players see exactly where they are in the order.
Yeah.
I used to also have one of the players at the table track initiative for the entire thing. I've since stopped doing that because I actually felt that as DM, A, being able to keep secrets in the initiative order, and B, being able to have the control over the pacing in combat was really important.
Yeah.
The next biggest task you're going to have in combat is actually tracking monsters' hit points. And this is another area where things can really, really slow down with both the addition and all the math. I have two solutions for this. The first one is a tip that Kelly started doing before I started doing it, but I've adopted it and I love it.
And that is running standard damage or static damage.
Yeah, so having monsters deal the average damage listed in their monster manual entry, as opposed to actually just rolling it every time, will save you a ton of addition and subtraction, mainly because monsters tend to roll way more dice than players do.
Yeah. And it can really slow down the game, especially if you're me and you're really bad at doing calculations at the table. So when my dragon does a breath attack, rather than rolling all those dice, I just take the average amount, which is written in the monster stat block, and just apply that and tell the players that that's how much damage they're taking.
If you want to have a boss monster, you can actually, or a critical hit, just double that for a critical hit, or a really dangerous creature could deal max damage with their attacks. It's way faster. Another quick thing that you'll want to do is obviously track damage that's applied. I make my players do this individually, and I trust them. Some DMs don't, and they like to track all the hit points for their players themselves. That's your prerogative entirely. But for tracking damage on monsters, I recommend using an addition method rather than subtraction. So rather than writing out the entire monster's hit point total and subtracting from that, simply write down in a column each piece of damage that the monster has taken and keep a running total of basically the player's score. And as soon as that number exceeds the monster's hit points, they're dead. Easy. Addition, for me at least, is way faster than subtraction. So I find that adding up the hit points is much easier. I actually do it on the scrap piece of paper where I'm tracking initiative. So there's even less for me to worry about.
When I'm preparing my my combats ahead of time, I have that scrap piece of paper and I write down the names of all the different monsters and all the different combats, and I'll break the page up into those sections. So when it gets to the combat, I do just that. I just write down all the damage that's being dealt.
Yeah.
And go from there.
My final piece of advice with this is don't be afraid to minionize your monsters when the combat is dragging along. If you've got a combat encounter where all that's left are 10 zombies and the necromancer has been killed, I just like to say the next hit on that zombie slays it, no matter what. So when we use this term minion, which is borrowed from 4th edition D&D, which referred to monsters that only ever have one hit point, which is really, really useful if you're running a swarm of creatures. Generally, for myself, if I'm running a combat with more than 6 enemies, you can bet that the vast majority of the monsters beyond those core 6 are going to be minions of some kind that will just die in one hit.
So another big part of running your combat is a lot more than just the battle that's going on with attacks this way and that. There's also a lot of other effects that can happen around your battlefield.
Yeah, like a monk might come up and use Stunning Strike, or someone might be heavily damaged and you want to mark that they're bloodied, to use a 4th edition term. Or you might want to mark who's knocked prone or dying, or even under the effect of the warlock's hex or the Hunter's Mark.
Or who's charmed, who's like any effect, really. Yeah.
We have two examples here. The first thing is one that I've been using for years and years, and these are just glass beads. You can get these at any craft store. They come in a huge range of colors, purple, red, blue, green, everything. And you can get a huge pile of these at a craft store for like $1. Sometimes even you can get a multi-pack for like $5. And really, if you have like 5 of each color, that's usually enough to track most things. And then I just like to remember them really easily. So I'll usually use things like purple for the Warlock's curses and stuff like that.
Red is always blood.
Yeah. And whatever they need to be on the moment. And sometimes you can just write that down on your notes and just say that purple marker means that's the center of the cloud kill effect or something like that. If you want to spend a little bit more money, Gale Force 9, who makes the spellbook cards, have these really beautiful tokens that are marked with words like incapacitated and dying and all the different status conditions and effects. And they even do some ones that let you write with a dry erase marker on top of them as well. So those are about $10 for a pack of each of them. I got 3 packs to make sure that I have multiples because you only get one of each status effect in those. I've also seen people do really creative things with different colored bottle caps.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes even just putting a slip of paper underneath the miniature is enough.
I've also found like printable online status cards that you can just like hand to the player that like has that status effect on them.
I come from a wargaming school, so I really like being able to like put the marker right beside the miniature on the field.
Yeah.
I find that that's really handy. And of course, if they're just getting knocked prone, I always just tip the mini right over. But sometimes you need to differentiate between someone who's prone and someone who's just a corpse.
Last but not least, we have improvised actions, which can be a whole number of things in combat.
So sometimes what's going to happen is a player is going to want to do something that you're completely not expecting. They might want to backflip over the dragon's head or kick a minecart down the rail to knock goblins off into a pit below. And you need to figure out like how much damage should that deal? What should the attack modifier be? Or what actually can handle that? Right?
Yeah, and it's important to just ask yourself, how difficult of a task is this for the player character?
Yeah, and how much damage should it deal? What kind of skill checks are going to be needed? This is where the Dungeon Master screen is really, really handy, especially the DM screen reincarnated, because inside the screen is a table that's on page 249 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. So it's tucked way back in there. And it's called the Damage by Level and Severity table. And what it tells you is how much damage an improvised action should deal based on whether you think it's a setback, a dangerous occurrence, or a deadly one, right? So for instance, if you wanted to improvise, like a player's like, I want to throw my torch in the troll's face, how much damage should that deal, right?
I'd say that's would you say that's a setback?
I would call that a setback.
Yeah.
Right?
Then what would, and then there's dangerous and deadly.
Yeah.
So what's an example of a dangerous? Like if I kick a flaming barrel into a goblin, is that more than the torch?
I think so, because that barrel might explode.
Yes.
And I often will roll randomly to find out if it does, because that would be the difference between a dangerous and a deadly one. Another great example of that might be of a dangerous thing is maybe there's a weak wall that a strong character can knock over and spill over onto somebody, right? So that would be something that's dangerous. And that's where a cool way of using this table is maybe the player wants to stun whoever they're hitting, and what I like to do is I'll set back one level for that. So the damage on an improvised action that would stun somebody is a setback damage, but it needs to have a dangerous threshold of improvisation.
And then a deadly one would be something like, I'm trying to think here.
Dipped into a vat of acid.
I was going to say pushing a statue on top of somebody.
A statue, I would probably make that a dangerous one, or I think that's going to depend on the size of the statue.
That's also true.
My good example of the deadly one would be the bell tower coming down, or cutting the bridge out. Anything with like rubble and broken things are always really, really good. Of course, if you do have like siege weapons on your battlefield, that would be another thing where you can use the tables in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Remember the time that you had a rogue that got knocked off a wall into a horse cart, and the horse cart ran away and then crashed into a river?
Yes, I remember.
That would be like... I gave you a couple saving throws for that to determine
and I failed all of them.
Yeah, and like if you want to have like a series of events, you could actually say, well, if the player makes 3 saving throws, it's just a setback. But if they keep failing their saving throws, it gets more and more, the damage piles on.
Yes, you drop kicked me off a wall onto a cart. The cart ran into a flaming building and then into a river. It was great.
I think you were like bleeding out after that.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah. That was pretty bad.
So some great tips about running combat at your table. One of my favorites is what I call having a plan B. And that is that I will orchestrate my combats with the monsters that I have, and then I'll always throw 1 or 2 extra monsters just behind my screen off to the side, just in case the party gets a really good upper hand and they're steamrolling through this encounter, and I feel like I just want to give them an extra little punch, or if I want to add a dramatic effect and they're halfway through the combat and they're like, oh, this is a breeze, but they didn't know 2 more trolls were hiding in the room off to the side, just about to burst forward. There's the element there that the party actually doesn't know
how screwed they are.
Yeah. And they have no idea what is and is not in existence. Technically, the entire dungeon is Schrodinger's dungeon.
Yeah.
Until the DM says it exists.
My tip for this is I like to use a 6-sided die. And I'll usually roll a d6. And in that many rounds, I'm going to change circumstances. So I'll never run a combat that just proceeds the same way unless the players have already created a massive plan. Like, if your players have made out a multi-phase way of, like, attacking a keep, which is what happened at our last game, which is a changing circumstance. But I'll roll that 6-sided die, and that's when either the reinforcements are alerted, or the bomb goes off, or a fire starts. Like, when in doubt, you can always make a combat more dramatic by starting a fire or adding an explosion.
That's one of the key rules that Monty taught me very early on. When in doubt, add an explosion.
It will just make that combat much more interesting, and add a level of stakes and danger to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Another quick tip for adjudicating combat. If you're doing a combat outside of a dungeon, and you are playing with a map and miniatures, I like to roll 2d6 and multiply that by 10. And that's how many feet the combatants start apart. If I haven't mapped the dungeon, or if I'm coming up with an area randomly, that's usually the point that the combat will definitely start. And if the players are like, well, wouldn't we have noticed that a little bit sooner? Then I'll just roll another die and add another 20, 30 feet and say, okay, well, then you can be further apart and they're not aware of you. Now you can try to get surprise. The other thing that I will say for players is players get a couple different colors of dice and roll your attack rolls and damage rolls at the same time.
Yes, that's a helpful tip for any player. Is if you are going to roll to attack and you do 2d6 damage, roll it at the same time, and you missed. But if you had hit,
yeah, that's kind of the depressing part. As you can see, when you would have done a lot of damage.
Yeah.
And then this is also where it's handy to have 2d20s of the same color, so you can still roll with advantage. And as well, I like to have 2d20s of the same color and then another set of d20s of another color. And that way, if you're a player with extra attack and you have advantage, you can roll everything all at once, which is really handy for when you really want to dig deep and brutalize that dragon.
So we hope that all these little bits of advice really help you run a smoother combat at your game table.
Yeah, and Dungeon Masters, we would love to hear your tips and tricks of ways that you've found to make your combats run smoothly, efficiently, and keep down on all that extra math that you have to keep in your head so you can really focus on the role-playing action at the table. So please tell us about that in the comments.
And for you players out there, we have a video on all the actions you can take in combat right over here.
And if you're interested in the new Dungeon Master screen Reincarnated, we've got a full review of it showing you what's inside right over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
In the dungeon.